Caledonian University at our seminar, and welcome also to our viewers online at our interactive webinar. My name is Branka Dimitrijević and I will chair today's event. Our seminars and webinars disseminate outcomes of feasibility studies and academic consultancies undertaken through our project. And our project supports collaboration between 7 Scottish universities and small to medium-sized enterprises in developing and testing innovations for more sustainable building design and refurbishment. Before I introduce today's speakers, just a few housekeeping points or management points. We are using an updated version of software for transmitting online. And if there are any problems, just bear with us. If we stop for a minute or two, we will restart and you can rejoin the event. There is also another possibility that there is a fire alarm. If that happens, we will have to stop our seminar, but we would return and continue. And if you can rejoin us, that would be great. But if not, we are filming this seminar, and the video recording will be saved on our website. So you can also watch the seminar or webinar later. We plan to finish the presentations around 1:30. At that time, our audience here and online will be able to ask questions, and our speakers will answer those questions. Our online audience will be using chat facility. And we plan to close the event at 2 o'clock. If any questions are not answered until that time, you can always send your questions by email, and they will be answered by our speakers after the event. So the title of today's seminar is an investigation of the adoption of low-carbon technologies by Scottish housing associations. This is a feasibility study that was undertaken by researchers at Robert Gordon University in collaboration with Anderson, Bell, and Christie architects. And the speakers today are Dr. David Moore and Dr. Seonaidh McDonald of Robert Gordon University, and Johnathan McQuillan of Anderson, Bell, and Christie Architects. And I would first ask Johnathan to start his presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Branka. Okay, hi there. My name's Johnathan McQuillan. I'm here today from Anderson Bell Christie Architects. And as Branka said, I'm here to talk about our feasibility study and investigation of the adoption of low carbon technologies by Scottish housing associations. With me today I have Dr. Seonaidh McDonald from Aberdeen Business School and Dr. David Moore from the Scott Sullivan School of Architecture. At this point, I'd also quite like to mention Interface. This is an organisation that Anderson Bell Christie approached at the early stages. Essentially, they helped us refine our idea and approach other academic bodies. So they actually made the introduction for us to the academics we have here today. From there, we developed the idea and put it forward to CIC Start. So just to say, if anybody has an idea they'd like to progress and seek academic consultancy with, they're a good body to approach. So how did Anderson Bell Christie identify the need for this research? Well, first of all, I would say that Anderson Bell Christie have used renewable technologies in a variety of projects. We've installed them in everything from social housing schemes to care homes to offices. And what we've found that generally on each project there is the design side, which is bespoke to each project, but there's also the delivery side, and it's the delivery side where we tend to run into the complexities. Just to give you an example of the design side, for example, a more rural scheme with integrated renewables into the roof makeup, so it's a more subtle approach to the building, and whereas where we've got a more urban setting, and indeed for an office block we've installed air source heat pumps that can also deliver cooling. So every design has to be specific for the building's users, and the building technology. And again, the architect is in a great position to orchestrate all of that and help control the process. From the delivery side, again, the architect is in a position where we can view the overall process and we can get an understanding of what is required in order to get it done. And effectively what we found is that there are three main items, which are maintenance, management, and finance. And if a project is going to run into a stumbling block, it'll run into a stumbling block here. So really, our question was, how can we overcome these barriers? Is there a way that we could do this on a bigger scale that would allow mass adoption of renewable technologies? The next point was really to identify what the focus of our study was going to be. At Andersonville Christie, the majority of our client base is actually in the domestic sector. We actually work with a number of housing associations and social landlords. But more importantly, over 25% of all homes in Scotland are actually rented from social landlords. Now, these are based on figures from Shelter from March last year, so they're reasonably current. But whenever you consider that there's around 600,000 homes which are actually only controlled by 243 social landlords, when you compare that to the 1.75 million private homes, there's a greater opportunity to make a large change in the social housing sector as compared to the private sector. So if you're going to enact a big mass change and actually make significant steps in carbon reduction, social housing is the sector to look at. So again, we looked at the energy drivers. These are all figures that I assume most people are familiar with. But housing accounts for around 27% of all carbon emissions. So you can see that with the 25% of the actual Scottish market being social housing, you can see you can make a significant impact in carbon reduction. And that'll go a long way to achieving the UK's targets of an 80% reduction by 2050. Consider again the fact that 86% of all housing stock is currently in existence. There's no reason not to start working on that stock now. The technology is available and the stock is there, and it's just a case of making something happen and getting action in the sector. What I'd also point out is the Scottish Housing Quality Standard. This has been running for a while now and is due to complete in 2015. But this endeavours to achieve a SAP of 50, a working central heating system, 100mm loft insulation, and insulation to the heating pipes within social landlord dwellings. So it's a fantastic first step. So a lot of the groundwork has been done, and I think we're now ready to move on to the next step. So again, what I want to do here is look at the actual need for renewables. This is actually a study by the Energy Efficiency Partnership for Homes. This was carried out last year, but in this study they sought to seek out what really is the financially viable solution to achieving an 80% reduction in carbon emissions in the domestic sector by 2050. And they broke it down into a series of sets. You can see at the 15% by 2030, a lot of the items there are items which are actually covered under the Scottish Housing Quality Standard. So a lot of the groundwork has been done. To get to the 50%, you need to introduce double glazing, and they've suggested heat pumps. So in order to make that big jump between 15 and 50, technology is a vital part. And again, to get up to 70, they're talking about introducing photovoltaics and solar water heating. So in order to get to that 80%, it is clear we have to use renewables. The next section, I want to talk about the financial side. The fabric improvements within a building, it's actually quite difficult to recoup your capital outlay. So if a housing association makes an outlay on improving the building fabric, that will actually increase the value of the housing stock, but they won't be able to gain a return on it as rental rates are capped. So there's a maximum value you can recoup from those properties from the tenants. So as a result, improving building fabric, there's a certain limit of affordability and reward that you get in that section. What we see now, though, is the introduction of feed-in tariff and renewable heat incentive. These are schemes which are designed to incentivize the introduction of renewable technologies. For example, renewable heat incentive, which is due to start in July this year, is designed to pay back around a 12% rate of return on your investment. And it's, again, as I say, it's due to start this year, and it will last for a fixed period of 20 years. So these are all things which are currently available to housing associations and social landlords, and the potential is to get in there now and do it. There's also digression on feed-in tariff and renewable heat incentive, such that there's a limited time period when you can reap the maximum reward from this scheme, and that time period is now. So what would the strategy be? Under feed-in tariff and renewable heat incentive, it's the owner of the technology that gets the payments from the tariff. So the example I've taken here is if you were to put a solar thermal installation into the building, it would pay 8.5 pence per kilowatt hour of energy produced and consumed within that building. And that payment would be guaranteed for the 20 years of the building's lifestyle. Now this is obviously before digression kicks in 2012. So there's a clear payback period. So what would happen is the social landlord would apply for the capital funding, and they would install the technology, and they'd be responsible for maintaining the system, so it'd be completely in their ownership. So they would be the ones that draw down the tariff. The tenants, as a result, would receive free energy, and the social landlord at the back of it has revenue which they can then use to regenerate further stock and do more retrofit projects. So it introduces a revenue stream that previously didn't exist within the social landlord. So in essence, what we're looking at is making a social landlord become an energy services company. Again, what we've discovered is that actually there's quite a good suit between energy services companies and social landlords. Social landlords, they're regulated, reasonable amount of certainty. They've got good credit ratings, and they've got access to low-cost finance, which is critical if you're hoping to make a return on your capital investment. Their core business is actually managing capital assets. So they've got the infrastructure in place within their own organizations to do this. And that includes collecting rent from tenants. So if there's to be an element of recouping costs from tenants, they're best placed to do that. Again, as discussed previously, they control a small number of organizations control the largest part of the stock. And I think fundamentally they can take a long-term view in the investment. Like whenever you consider feed-in tariff and renewable heat incentive, if you're talking about a period of 20 years, it's not so much in a private investor's interest to do that. However, a housing association or social landlord is actually better able to do that. So we feel it should fall to the social housing sector in the first instance to look at this. Again, we would suggest that it's actually a very good fit for social landlords as well. Aside from anything else, it will improve asset values over time. It will alleviate fuel poverty for tenants, which is a core value of social housing. It will generate revenue for future work, and it will reduce the tenants' bills whilst lowering emissions. And I think as well, fundamentally, it will create long-term jobs, again, that previously didn't exist in the sector. However, becoming an energy services company is actually a very large step for any organization. So despite the fact that a lot of the systems are in place to do it, it will take a leap of faith to get there. So the question we really had was, what are the barriers? What is stopping social landlords from making this jump and embracing renewable technologies and these incentives? And that's where I'll hand over to Dr. Seonaidh McDonald, who will go through our research study and go into a bit more depth on how we analysed it and the findings. Thank you, Seonaidh.
So this is a feasibility study, and it's been undertaken across 2 different academic disciplines within the business school and within the construction field. So I represent the business school, and my background is in looking at consumer decision making around lots of different sustainable technologies and other green products. So this is applying a sort of organisational behaviour look at how the decisions were actually made within these housing associations. So we began by selecting some of the clients that Johnathan had previously worked with in the past and meeting them as a group. And then we undertook a series of qualitative, what you might call semi-structured or in-depth interviews with key members of each of those housing associations. And these are the two. And as you can see, we let them select their own key stakeholders, if you like, in this decision-making process, which from an organisational behaviour perspective is interesting in itself, because as you can see, they've offered me different candidates that they regard as key stakeholders in this decision-making process. And one of the things that's very interesting about this is that it's our first clue, if you like, that although these decisions are within the same sector, they're within the same city, within the same kinds of housing stock, these decision-making processes are actually quite different and they have very different outcomes. So following that, the interviews are recorded and transcribed and shared with the team. And I've done two kinds of analysis here, and I'll share the most accessible one with you here, which is the decision-making framework, which, as I say, was developed in previous work that I've done to work with individual consumers. And it's very interesting to see how the individual decision-making process is very much mirrored in the group decision-making processes that we see. So there's quite a lot of translation between households trying to decide whether they'll start a recycling system or whether they'll buy fair trade coffee. There's a great deal of parallels with these housing associations trying to decide whether or not to invest in low carbon technologies. The other analysis that's been undertaken is an activity theory analysis, which you'll find in the report, and if anybody wants to discuss that with me later or through email following reading the report, you're very welcome to do that, but I won't present it here. So this is the framework that we're using to look at the decision-making analysis, and you see several levels here. The box outside is trying to show the context within that the decision is made within. And of course there's lots of structural constraints here. It's within the Scottish legal system. All of those kinds of things frame a decision. There's a policy context here. There's also an economic climate here. There are moves, the legislation that Johnathan's described are all the context for this decision that's being made. And then the housing associations start with the possibility of all kinds of different low carbon technologies, and they come out with one specific decision. And there are two different things at work here. These are not stages, because they can be happening in an iterative way. They can happen gradually, and they can change as well. It's a dynamic setup, but there are basically weak filters and strong filters. And the weak filters are things that we'd like to take into consideration, but often they just get compromised out of the equation. So the final decision, they may, for the example for an individual, might be that somebody believes that fair trade coffee is actually the best thing to buy, or organic vegetables are very important to support local farmers, but actually in their final decision making that doesn't actually sway their decision. Cost, availability, all these sorts of things override that. So the things like cost are found to be stronger filters. So this was a decision, this is the model was developed, as I say, for individual consumers, and I'm going to show you now some of our results framed in that decision-making model. So you can see that the context here for the first housing association, very much everything framed in this housing association by the outcome of a previous project, which is not perceived by them to be successful. And everything is coloured by that happening in their past. They're strong filters. One of the reasons that I've put here in non-criteria they don't offer it to me as an explicit non-criteria. An explicit non-criteria would be something where people said we didn't take account of X in our decision making. We knew it was there, but we put it aside. But here there are implicit decision making going on around carbon reduction. And actually this housing association's primary concern is with tenant access and tenant behaviour and the service and operation of the kit that they put in. So for example, they're looking here at joint boilers which go across several households. And for the housing association, this is seen not as a green move, not as something to reduce carbon emissions, but to something that reduces the need for them to go into individual properties for service and maintenance, which is a huge issue in this sector. So the access becomes a very strong decision-making part of this, which you might not expect coming from outside of that sector. So the idea that you don't have to go into individual people's flats and look at individual boilers, but you could go downstairs into a cupboard that the factor had control of and look at one big boiler and service 16 households is very attractive in this sector. Tenant affordability, of course, fuel poverty is a really big issue in this sector, and maintenance costs and maintenance problems are also perceived to be important in the decision-making process. And we'll see that coming up again in the second data set as well. So this is a housing association who have started with the will to do something that is low carbon. They've gone through a decision-making process, but ultimately their decision is against that technology. What we see here is another housing association within the same city going through a decision-making process. They have a lot of the same criteria, but they use them in very different ways. So where maintenance costs and the unknown nature of what the maintenance budgets would be for these technologies became something that was a very strong filter for the last group. For this group, it's a weaker filter. So the criteria are the same, and we often see this in consumer decision-making as well. The criteria are remarkably similar household by household, but the actual decision outcomes are different because some of them use the criteria as weak filters, whereas some of them use them as strong filters, and it stops the decision making. So here we have a decision by a housing association to invest in a specific low carbon technology, and they have a very different view of this. And one of the things that we found was very interesting was the sort of decision-making cultures within these two. And it's our belief that the decision-making cultures have contributed to the actual outcomes as much as the performance of the technologies, the knowledge about the technologies, and all of these other things. So one of the things that we're quite interested in within the organizational behavior literature is this idea of perspective making versus perspective taking. And this comes from American scholars, where perspective making is the enculturation, if you like, that you go through to be part of your own profession. So as an architect, you have a degree program, you'd have work within architecture practices, you'd take on the norms of being an architect. What do architects wear? What do architects like? What do architects care about? And in some cases, these green technologies become embedded in these norms in specific ways. And perspective taking is a slightly different process. Rather than the building up of your own professional identity, this is about how you assimilate information that comes from professions that are not your own. So how do you take on board what academics are saying, what the press is saying, what the government want, what industry bodies are driving towards? How do you assimilate that within your own expertise? How do you make decisions across different priorities, different worldviews, and how do you incorporate those into your decision making? Now, in lots of cases, the answer is you don't. People stay very much within the professional boundaries in which they were educated and what we would say in sociology, enculturated. And they take their norms through their lives. Now, this is a very difficult problem that cuts across, as you could see from my list of interviewees, many parts of a housing association. It's a problem that can be looked at through academic lenses, through practice lenses, through architectural lenses. And all of these are different kinds of expertise. So what David's going to talk about now is a little bit about how you can combine those and how these perspective making and perspective taking views were evident in the data that we surfaced.
Good afternoon. Right, as Seonaidh mentioned there, I'm going to pick up on some of the points that have been introduced, but I'll be doing it from a slightly different perspective because we're a multidisciplinary team, which was an interesting experience in many respects, and slightly different from, I think, what most of us have been used to doing in the past. So there were interesting things there that we learned as a team and the way that we operated things. My background is primarily in management, construction project management particularly. So I started out from this with very much a management mindset, but as we went through it, I made one or two interesting discoveries as well, and got my boundaries widened a little bit. So that was a very valuable experience that I found within that. Could I also just say hello to the fourth member of the team, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, Dr. Mohammed Abdul Wahab. Hopefully he's managing to watch online. He did say he would try to, but I think he had to be elsewhere. So if I can just acknowledge his input into the research as well. So just to pick up on where we were with the previous ones, we got the two housing associations, which were anonymised, HA1 and HA2. Not the most glamorous of labels, but it works in that sense. Known to Johnathan in particular previously, and the key thing I think that was interesting to us as the starting point was this fact that they had made different investment decisions. Now, I use investment in a particular sense, perhaps, and that's one of the other issues that is maybe worth just flagging up here, is that my background leads me to use terminology in a particular way. Other people's backgrounds may find that terminology doesn't quite fit with their experience. So I'm sure that if that's the case, particularly online viewers can ask questions which, if they've got any confusion or any uncertainty about the terminology that's used, by all means ask the question, and we'll see what we can do to clarify that. So investment decisions in terms of sustainable technologies. That was the focus. That was the key attraction that we got as far as this particular research project was concerned. Now, the terminology. This is the model that we started out by considering, and I think it's worth just picking up on some of this at this point, just to try and explain some of the key aspects of it, because it did, to a fair extent, structure the way that the information was looked at, the way that it was processed. This is probably not familiar to the majority of people, in that it's not necessarily something which certainly the housing association sector has perhaps come across very often. Some individuals may be aware of it, others not. I have no intention of going into this in great detail. It's just to give an overview of it, but again, if there are any particular questions about this, then that's fine. We can deal with that in the question and answer session. The starting point that we had really was the concept of the unified business process, as in, what are the barriers to this with regard to housing associations and sustainable technologies. As Johnathan mentioned earlier on, there are lots of opportunities, apparent opportunities within the sector. Some players within the sector are getting involved, others are not. Why might that be? The unified business process was just one vehicle really for trying to look at that. And it comes from two areas that are really brought together. The rationalized process, the RUP, which is very much focused on projects. Now we've got some projects going on here, in as much as housing associations, the two that we looked at in particular, have a history of being involved in projects. And of course, as Seonaidh mentioned, one of those projects in particular for one of the housing associations was quite instrumental in the way that they viewed technologies from that point on. So the project focus is useful. The business process management, the BPM, looks more at the collaboration and social focus. So by bringing the two together, what we're trying to get here is something which recognizes that organizations are rarely homogeneous. Okay? They're generally composed of functions. It's the traditional model for the majority of organizations, and indeed for the majority of projects in many senses. It's the traditional model. Functional specialism may be a term that some are familiar with. Flowing from that functional specialism, there tends to be what we refer to as a silo mentality. And again, this is part of the culturation that Seonaidh mentioned. It has an impact in that direction, in that as you specialize in a particular area, you take on the values of that area, what's seen as being good, what's seen as being bad, but also that can introduce barriers between the silos, effectively. It affects communication. It affects the unification across the organization. It has advantages. I'm not saying it's a terrible thing. It's had disadvantages, but in this particular context, it has these specific problems with regard to acting as a barrier to unifying the overall process. And I refer to unifying in terms of trying to get to the situation where all the players within the decision making are of one mind, are of the same mind with regard to what's important, what's not important. Okay? But taking it outside of the silos, outside of the functional specialisms, okay? I bring it into the wider context. So we have these business processes, these functions. Unifying them can become difficult because of the silos. However, that is something which is generally looked at in a more commercial environment. Housing associations maybe occupy a slightly different area, in that the usual perspective on them is that they're perhaps more socially oriented, they're more social objectives. Yes, there's money involved, they have to make sound investment decisions, but it's a slightly different context. So, do those supposed more social objectives cause this unifying to operate in a different way? Do they, to some extent, facilitate the unifying and therefore help the decision-making process along? And are they a factor in whether an organization adopts a particular technology or not? My particular approach to this aspect was initially to start by looking at the language that both of the organizations, both of the housing associations used when undertaking this social aspect of their work, particularly the way that they presented themselves to what we refer to the external environment. Everybody outside of the housing association, people who are not directly employed with them, but maybe make use of their services, maybe want to work with them in a different way, but not directly employed within the association itself. So how do they do that? How do they present themselves to the external environment? In doing this, I was looking for particular evidence, if you will, with regard to how they use terminology, how they communicated. And particularly looking for the extent of what could be referred to as passive-aggressive terminology and positive-aggressive. Sorry, passive-reactive and positive-aggressive terminology. So, two opposite ends of the spectrum. To what extent was that kind of phraseology used by these associations when they were communicating with their external environment? And as we went through that, initially I was kind of looking for evidence related to their propensity to innovate. Okay? Were they talking about innovation in different ways? Did they value innovation in different ways? So looking at the way that they use language in context of innovation initially, then that gave me, certainly at this point, hopefully an insight into what to expect from them in the way they made decisions about technologies, particularly low carbon technologies in this case. Whether they would actually carry that through or not remains to be seen, but it gave that initial perspective. So, high level of passive reactive content, that's generally focused on specific behaviors. And so the organization you would tend to expect will behave in particular ways, things like risk avoidance, passive, they tend to react after the event rather than before the event. A slow rate of change is usually typical of these kind of organizations because they react rather than being in front of something that's coming up. And also a high level of what you refer to as protection. How much did they value the people that they were, in their perspective, working on behalf of? So they're responsible for them, they're working on behalf of them, how much do they want to protect them? High level of positive aggressive content, on the other hand, we're typically looking here at behaviors which are focused on higher levels of risk tolerance. They're willing to take higher risks. They'll usually exhibit above average for whatever sector we're looking at, in this case the housing association sector, higher than average rates of change. So as the sector itself is changing at a particular rate, these organizations will change at a higher rate. And sponsoring rather than protecting the individuals that they see themselves as being responsible for, individuals or groups. So they'll support them, but they support them in a different way. And it's a more aggressive way rather than reactive way. So they're looking for opportunities within the environment around them. So the two housing associations that we've labelled up anonymous terms, HA1, HA2. If we look at HA2 first, their culture on this initial analysis, and this is not taking into account anything that Seonaidh did in her analysis, that was then brought together at a later point. So they were done separately up to bringing together a later point of the project. Their culture emphasizes economic growth, which is fine. They do actually have a business development strategy, which is perhaps unusual in this sector, but it's there. That is a reflection perhaps of their entrepreneurial environment. Within that environment, they talk very positively about innovation, new initiatives, new opportunities, particularly for sponsoring those people that they see themselves as being responsible for, putting them in a situation where they can become themselves more entrepreneurial. So perhaps in terms of things like ESCOs and so on, then maybe this organisation would be expected to move more easily into that area, but that remains to be seen. So the focus on seeking entrepreneurial opportunities that provide opportunity to what they see as being their community. They value that community and they want benefit to that community. But they're not particularly risk averse in doing that. HA1, however, appears to recognise that whilst there is value in innovating, they are not against innovation by any means, but they will approach it in a particular way. The implication is that they'll only do it when the people, the community that they see themselves as being responsible for, actually say that they want them to do it. Okay, so it's reactive in that sense, rather than HA2 are perhaps more aggressive and say, this is an opportunity, we think it would be good for our community, therefore we're going to go in that direction. So in terms of the context, the culture of the decision making, quite different, particularly with regard to innovation, which was the focus that we had within this particular project. So the two housing associations have different emphases within their business processes. They're both looking for opportunities, but they do it in very, very different ways with regard to how they embrace innovation within these organizations. Seonaidh earlier mentioned activity theory, and again, I don't particularly want to get into it in detail here, but I just want to mention it in as much as introducing how we linked some of the material together. Because I say up to a certain point of the project, the analyses were done separately so that they were quite independent of each other, and then we looked at the results and how they might come together, using things like the results of activity theory analysis. In this context, we're looking at trying to put the organization into more of a social context with regard to its functions. Typically, as we said, functions in the traditional model are very much separated, silos, functional specialisms, etc. So we're used to that particular way of looking at things. In this context, we're now trying to put it into more of a social analysis and not looking just at the functional specialisms on their own. So that kind of context, the things that we're looking at, roles, responsibilities, all of those things which essentially we regard as being cultural, reflecting the culture of the organization. And because of that, they're generally embedded very deeply. Yes, there are explicit statements that are visible that organizations make, but a lot of what they do within the business process does remain internal to the organization, and certainly as far as the external environment is concerned, is not explicitly visible. Unless you're working with that organization constantly, quite a bit of what they do in this context, it remains invisible and therefore is difficult to observe directly. It also tends to be dynamic in nature. So it changes over time, yes. The values that are in there, they become different values as opportunities, situations change. So that tends to be another issue that is not always appreciated. The way that this dynamic context causes decision-making itself to change. So, when we got organizations that are composed of multiple communities, we tend to, again, traditionally, expect them to organize themselves in a particular way. Typically, that will be lateral organization, in that you get many specialisms, functions, arranged across the association of the organization, all of it approximately equivalent authority. So no one specialism tends to dominate. It's organized in that particular way. And that was typical of Housing Association 1. They were very much organized in that way. So all the specialisms that they had, given equal value, equal authority. Housing Association 2, HA2, however, was atypical in that it tended towards the more hierarchical structure. Not as many functional specialisms made explicit within the organization. They were there, but not explicitly presented in the traditional manner. So more of a hierarchical structure, again, maybe in line with the analysis about the particular culture, their approach to innovation and making of decisions. Linking that to the perspective making aspect, what we got within this one, Housing Association 1 is effectively taking a making perspective. Okay? It's looking at its community, it's saying what does its community want, and then basing its decisions around that. All the voices tend to have the same perspective. Everybody tends to have to be in agreement because they're all of equal authority. We all have to be in agreement before an overall decision can be made. So again, that was what we found within HA1. And only the communities within the internal boundary are party to that. It's only concerned about its community. And it puts a boundary around that and it tends to protect that community. So it's not too worried about what's going on externally. We can also view a product in terms of perspective taking. And this is the approach that we found within Housing Association 2. In this context, they're taking other communities, taking a wider perspective, not just their immediate community, the people who are view themselves as responsible for, but they're taking other communities into account as well. And those voices within the community include people that maybe HA1, organisations that HA1 would not particularly consider. They're not formally part of the decision-making activity, but they are certainly considered within that activity, the making of decisions. So they are a factor within that. What do these other communities think about the decision that we are about to make? And that's part of their perspective taking, considering the other organisations external to them, and giving it a wider context. So in sense of risk-taking, then we tend to find that they are more innovative, more entrepreneurial, and go about the decision-making in a slightly different way. Conclusions that we have for the report, a number of conclusions. I'll pick out, not all of them, but I'll pick out perhaps the key ones as far as we were concerned, and also the suggestions for further research based on that. One of the things that we did find with this, that yes, we had an expectation as to where things may come, the results may come out of this particular research project. What we actually found was that a lot of what was happening within this environment was more subtle than we had initially anticipated. And we kind of thought it would all be reasonably explicit, but in quite a few cases, the decisions related to the business process were actually more subtle. There were other things involved in this that were not initially visible to the process. And some of those did act as barriers to being willing to adopt innovative technologies. The individual consumer decision-making model, the model that Seonaidh referred to earlier, can provide a number of important insights. We've found that transferring, as it were, that model into this context does have a benefit. It does give some useful insights, particularly with regard to the decision-making of the organisation. Reveals things that in the traditional approaches we would not necessarily have expected to find. So it's a useful transference of a research model within the context of this multidisciplinary approach that we've applied here. We think it's going to be a useful tool for the study, particularly with regard to why housing associations in a wider context don't seem to be absorbing, don't seem to be taking the opportunities to adopt low carbon technologies. There is some adoption, yes, but it's maybe not the level that you would hope for. And why is that the case? We found in this research project some of the factors involved in that with regard to the decision making, but we think that the model that we've used is a powerful one and can be used further, throw more light on the situation, particularly so within this relatively unexplored housing association context, which has not been applied before. So, key factors that we found within the research. As far as the decision making for adoption of low carbon technology is concerned, we found that the presence or absence of a sustainability champion was a key factor. Somebody who could push effectively the decision to make with regard to adoption of low carbon technologies. And to do that in a context which allowed people, particularly with regard to Housing Association 2, we found this, that the perspective taking, bringing in the wider context, actually allowed one person to lead the decision-making process, rather than the process being bogged down in everybody having an equal say in it and everybody having to agree in it. And so it was allowed to be led, and that sustainability champion did seem to be a key factor within this. However, the sustainability champion does need to be awarded a particular level of authority. If they don't have that, it's extremely difficult, no matter how motivated they are, it's extremely difficult for them to lead the decision. And we're not talking necessarily about traditional authority in terms of positional, in terms of the hierarchy. This is authority in terms of being recognized as the right person to lead this decision. And that brings them along. In some aspects it's referred to as sapiential, knowledge-based authority. So it does give them that ability to lead, even when they don't have a strong positional authority. They can drive it along. The nature of the organization's perspective regarding are they perspective making, are they perspective taking? Okay, that was one of the unexpected things that, well, certainly from my viewpoint, it was unexpected that we would find something like that, but it was actually an important key factor. What perspective do they take? And those who are adopting the perspective making stance or approach, they'll typically be slow to adopt. Not unwilling to adopt, but slow to adopt. Okay? Whereas someone who's perspective taking will usually be more rapidly taking the decision to adopt these technologies. The position with regard to how far the organisation is away from what we label the tipping point, the point at which they decide, yes, we will do this. They move from perhaps being cautiously optimistic to being possibly enthusiastic, but they decide to make the decision that, yes, we will do this. For those organisations such as HA1, which have adopted the perspective making approach, they tend to be further away from that tipping point. They need more information. They need more help in making that decision, getting to that decision point. And it's certain kinds of information that they need. So supplying that information would seem to be a key factor in moving them to that point so that they can then go ahead and adopt. Cultural factors, you can never underestimate or overestimate the value of cultural factors. They're always important. But in this instance, seems to be more influential for the housing associations than any structural issues. Okay? Again, a lot of it is normally invisible. It's embedded in the culture, which is not always explicitly presented. So the study indicates that the sector, Scottish Housing Association sector, not currently considering potential opportunities such as feed-in tariffs as being sufficient incentive across the sector. Some, yes, are moving towards that, but overall across the sector, not generally seen as being something which is regarded as being an opportunity that they've made the decision now to take, that opportunity. They may be considering it, but there's not the incentive there at the moment, it would seem, to push them to the tipping point or lead them to the tipping point and allow them to make that decision. So again, business intentions at strategic level tend to be explicit, tend to be visible, but it's not necessarily about those visible, strategic, explicit decisions. It can be about other decisions, such as with Housing Association 2. These kind of decisions reinforce the perception of it as being essentially a perspective-taking stance. It's sending messages to other organisations within the sector. And that tends to be more important, perhaps than micro-generation to provide additional income, which is there, it's an opportunity, but that may not be the main drive for an organisation. It may be something which is more of a cultural nature, and therefore more difficult perhaps to incentivise. Can't necessarily put a value on it. So opportunities across the sector as a whole, they're there, they're not necessarily being adopted by the sector as a whole, and this is one of the things that we as a research team would like to look further into. So in terms of further development of the work, then yeah, we're going to look for opportunities to take this further, take it wider, look at working with an increased number of housing associations if possible, and see how widely this model that we have at the moment applies across the sector. And I think that concludes.
Yes.
Hand over to Branka.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to our speakers, first of all, to Seonaidh, to David, to Johnathan. And now I would like to invite questions, both here from the audience in our seminar room and online. Online audience can ask questions by using chat facility. So, shall we start here first in the seminar room at Glasgow Caledonian University? Please, David, could you provide a microphone? Please, could you introduce yourself, please, and tell us where you work and so on?
Yeah. It's on, is it? Okay. My name's Charlie Russell from Glasgow Caledonian University. Really excellent talks. Thank you very much. My question actually, it's probably to all of you, but it came up for me in Seonaidh's talk. And describing context, I think that's really key here. You know, the context that the senior management team of the housing association has would very much largely shape any decision process that's happening. And in terms of, could I say, is the context of that team decisive in what happens? And you know, if you looked at the two different groupings that you had one had a managing director and one had a finance director, and there were different operational people in there. That dynamic surely must be key to how the whole thing flows out. Really, you know.
Yes, I think so. I think that what's very interesting here is that we tend to look at these kinds of decisions in a sort of black box way. So policy or government programs or funding streams go in, and uptake of these technologies comes out the other end. And we don't really know very much about what happens in the middle and why some people take these technologies and why they don't. So what this gives us the opportunity to see that this is the same policy context. These are in the same city, in the same sector. They're providing the same kinds of housing stock to the same kinds of clients. The same technologies are available to them. This is not a study in Scotland compared to a study in Germany or California where climate is different, and yet very different decisions are being made. And in my view, this is entirely cultural in terms of who is involved in the decision-making processes and how the decision-making processes pan out. Now, these decision-making processes are not something that's unique to low-carbon technologies. You probably find that a study of whether or not to refit double glazing in X, Y, or Z tenement block would be met with a similar decision-making process from within each of these organisations. So they have ways of making decisions, culturally accepted norms about who decides and how things get done. And that very much affects the uptake of these technologies. And as you know, David's pointing out, these feed-in tariffs are an opportunity that is not being taken up by some of these housing associations. And this analysis, a sort of more processual analysis, is helping us begin to understand why that's the case. What is their thinking? What processes do they go through? Who do they consult? What do they do? Some of them sought a lot of information from tenants of schemes outside their own who already had these technologies in place. Others didn't. They both had, as David pointed out, environment champions within the organisations who are very, very keen to have these green technologies adopted by the individual housing associations, but one of them was very successful in what on the face of it looks like a very traditional, old-fashioned hierarchical system of decision making, whereas a much more liberal, what we see in the management textbooks as a better, whatever that is, decision making process, which is more open and more extended and more respectful of other kinds of expertise, actually worked against them and led to decisions being made against low carbon technologies. So very interesting to look at these processes, and I quite agree. I think decision-making culture explains at least as much of this as anything else can.
Yeah, I think because there is investment needed, and at a time where it is perceived risky, some organizations will be very much taking advantage of, seizing the moment, if you like, and going for it. Others will be hunker down, let's get through it kind of thing, chaps, Second World War kind of viewpoint.
One of the things that we found for both of these organisations in terms of missing information was this long-term maintenance costs. These are organisations which like to have a 30 or 50-year plan, which in the private sector is hilarious, because that could never be done. But in the public sector, they've come from a different kind of decision-making frame, and they're trying to work out, they know if they buy double glazing what the energy efficiencies will be, but they also know what the maintenance of those products will be over a 20 and 30-year timescale, how much it will cost and how much they can budget. They don't know that for solar panels because we haven't got that kind of data. And that is a huge barrier for these individual, particularly the organisations as you're mentioning, that are more, they're interested in the innovation, but they're more wary of taking these risks. And in this kind of environment, that lack of information is a major barrier, and that came out very strongly.
Okay, here is another question here in the first row. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us where you work?
My name is Vidya. I'm working for Tenants First Housing Cooperative and Glasgow School of Art. My question is, when you're doing the research, have you taken into account the current situation where there are cuts and in public fundings, so they can become more concerned about investing the available grant that they have for renewables? Well, that's my question really, because it's kind of create another barrier that our funding is even more limited, and then this is not tested. Kind of, as you said, there is a cultural issue that we don't have solar panel before, so we don't know how it performs. So yeah,
there's a double-edged sword with the current economic climate, and because on the one hand, it's perhaps seen as more risky when you have less money, but in another way, there's a real fuel poverty issue, and so the structures that feed-in tariffs, for example, offer, arguably address fuel poverty in a very strong central way, and for that reason the housing associations see it as a very positive step. So yes, from an investment point of view, a more difficult decision and perhaps an increased perception of risk in this climate, but then from a tenant perspective, and again it depends which voices are being heard at the decision-making table, and in one of these housing associations, the tenant is characterised very much at the decision-making table through the housing manager, and that's absent from the other decision-making process. Jonathan, do you want to add to that?
I think the other thing is this is why began to look at energy services companies as a model as well. I think it's clear that the existing finance models don't quite serve the need for renewable technologies. Certainly, like HAG funding and the traditional methods of putting down funding aren't going to be available in the future. So we're aware that the amount of new build projects is actually going to drop significantly. But the sector that is opening up, on the other hand, is retrofit. And there are new funding models coming out, and as a result of feed-in tariff and renewable heat incentive, they anticipate that various funders will come forth to actually provide funding for these. One, I was referring earlier to the Energy Efficiency Partnership for Homes. The National Housing Federation again commissioned a study from them which looked into a method where housing associations could potentially draw down funding. And this study was actually reported on, I think, November 2010, so it's a reasonably recent study during the economic crisis. And what they actually investigated was drawing down lump sums of money from the European Investment Bank. And they worked with the European Investment Bank to work out how they could draw down money to actually fund large-scale projects. Now, what they found was, in order to get this to work, they actually had to draw down large lump sum of money. So in order to do it, they envisaged a couple of models, one of which was creating like an umbrella company which operated as an energy services company, and from there the funding could be siphoned off to the members of that organisation. So I think there has to be a change in mindset as well as how this actually happens. And this is, I think, again, the next stage of the process, and it's something that's been borne out from the research. So as we've gone through the research, this is what we've come to realise. And like, I think the thing to remember is that this is a feasibility study, and it wasn't a direct academic consultancy. So it's about as much asking questions and finding a route for a solution as it is to presenting answers.
Okay, we have now questions also from online audience. For example, from Bruce Newlands. Did the study find any different outcomes between applying technologies in a retrofit and new build situation in terms of financial incentive, risk, and potential social benefits? So, any different outcomes between applying technologies in retrofit and new build situation?
I think within the study, we didn't really differentiate between new builds and retrofit. I think during the study, the realization was there that actually it's not new build that is the target, it should be retrofit, because that's where the clear and present need is. With the changing building regulations, by the time we get to 2016, all new domestic buildings are going to have to be zero carbon anyway. So the demand isn't really, or the problems I suppose aren't really on that side, it's more on the retrofit side, so that's where we ended up focusing. I don't know if we got into any specific variables between retrofit and new build within the interviews with the...
No, I think the emphasis was quite similar in these two projects, and it's very difficult when you have just two projects to look at. You're aware that the more that you vary, the less comparable the two outcomes become. And so what we've gone for is what we focused on in our sampling was one reject decision and one accept decision, but both of which had gone through a full decision-making process, so that we could look at that in lots of detail, rather than looking at whether they were retrofit or new build. But it's definitely, if we were to widen this study now based on the feasibility study, I think the emphasis would be on retrofit given the market, but I think the new build issues would certainly be something that we would want to compare in a bigger sample, definitely.
I think there's maybe a slight linkage between the new build and the retrofit, in as much as there may be a possibility of gathering some information within a new build context about performance of materials and technologies and so on, which could possibly help to overcome the information issue that housing associations have with regard to retrofitting. If they could be allowed to feel a little bit more comfortable with the decision because of information, if that may have come from new build, fine. But I think that might be a slight connection between the two. But otherwise, I think it is very much a case of focusing on retrofit rather than the new build.
Okay, we have more questions from online viewers. From Dave Tremlin. Is anyone doing anything to alter organizational cultures to get to more joined-up policy making across the sector so that targets can be more clearly identified and resources better utilized?
Well, I think this is one of the things that our study's really thrown up, is that when people talk about low-carbon technologies, people talk about technology, the science and how that works, and the engineering, and also the people talk about the architecture, how you can integrate that into buildings and whether or not it works, the logistics of tenants actually using it. But what we're not seeing is this cultural emphasis on whether or not it's being adopted and why. And we need, to me, my answer would be no, I don't think enough is being done there. And we've thrown it up as a really serious barrier to implementation.
Yeah, I think the incentivisation aspect of it is perhaps implied that it's going to help in that, but otherwise, no. It's going to be more explicit.
We're nodding. The gentleman's answering his own question.
Yes, here is a comment from Dave Chamlin. I assume that that was the purpose of this study.
Yeah.
Okay, we have one more question from Zoe Holiday. I was interested in Johnathan's comment that social housing providers are well suited to setting up ESCOs. Why do you think that there has been such low uptake of ESCOs in Scotland, even compared to the rest of the UK? What do you think can be done to encourage registered social landlords and local authorities to set these up?
Yes, I think that's a great question. The answer is probably data, as Seonaidh suggests. Yes, there's a very clear opportunity for them, but as we discovered, well, certainly from our perspective as Anderson Bell Christie, whenever we've enacted these projects, the stumbling blocks always come on the delivery side, which again is the management, maintenance, and finance. But I think the key to actually overcoming a lot of these stumbling blocks is data. The other side of the coin, I suppose, is also the finance side, and studying that and working out an actual business model. Because I think as well it needs to be made explicit what that business model would be. Because just to, I suppose, to become an energy services company, I suppose the theory of it seems fairly straightforward, but the actual practicality of making it happen is a very different task. And it's quite a lot for an organisation to either add this on or become an energy services company throughout what they do. But I think it is something that should be seriously considered within the sector.
Okay, a question from Harry Phillips. Is it the view that a conservative housing association, i.e. Housing Association 1, cannot ever become a more risk-taking organization like Housing Association 2? If the leader of the organization is conservative or feels restricted by Housing Association rules, then that organization will be destined to move very slowly. In other words, as ever, progress is largely down to the imagination and ability of the leader.
Well, I think that what we found when we interviewed the senior management in these two housing associations was a startlingly similar view of the problem. That here was an opportunity, that here were technologies, and in the future there were going to be legislation around carbon reduction, that these technologies would help solve that problem, and that it was very important that some housing associations took the lead in that and took an innovative stance. And that's where the similarity of the view ended. And one housing association said, and so other people need to take these risks. This is not for us to do. And the other housing association said, and so someone must go first, and so that's our job. And so in a way there's a lot of agreement around this, about the fact that it was innovative and risky and so on, but the characters of the two housing associations made them answer that challenge very differently. And I think that in answer to Harry's question, it's not that a conservative housing association, we can't have an impact. As David said, a lot of this is very implicit and internally focused. We can't necessarily have an impact on their decision-making processes, but for the conservative ones, more information, more maintenance information specifically about these technologies is going to be needed to reassure them that this is no longer a risky situation. So what we need is for the housing association twos of this world to step up, try it out, for academics to get involved and monitor that in terms of performance, in terms of tenant payback, and in terms of maintenance costs and projected lifetimes of equipment, and then come back to the HA1s of the world and say, look, here we are. Partnerships between academics and housing associations that are at the forefront to convince other housing associations that this is the way to go. They're not going to listen to consultants, quite rightly. They're not going to listen to academics, who would, but they will listen to other housing associations if they genuinely have saved money and they genuinely have controllable maintenance costs.
Yeah, I think that's a key thing. It's maybe not so much the risk. If the risk is understood, then you can move an organisation forward. But in more of an uncertainty context, where the information is just not available, so people are uncertain about what is going to happen, then yes, the HA1s tend to stand back, the HA2s tend to move in. So it is a matter of getting that information to reduce the uncertainty, and then there is the possibility of both types of associations moving forward.
There is also a comment from Harry Phillips. A major difference between new build installations and retrofit is the VAT overhead on retrofit. So that's another barrier added there. Then we have a question from Roy Guthrie, or comment. Maintenance of renewables can be costed and projected, then budgeted for. This is being used as an excuse to say no to renewables. How do we get around this? Any comments?
I think there are costs that are provided by the sellers of the individual technologies. But what we don't have is independent user costs, experience, and that's what's lacking. So yes, we can project maintenance costs from the manufacturers of these different pieces of equipment, but the housing associations are not ready to invest and take the word of those consultants, particularly as we saw in the case of HA1, where they'd had a very bad experience in the past, and so have become very cynical and less willing to take these kinds of risks based on the knowledge of expert consultants or manufacturers.
I think as well, there's another scenario whereby because the market is new and it's evolving, I think there's sometimes a feeling that if a housing association installs a technology, 2 years later, there might be another version of that technology which will supersede what has happened in the past. And so they potentially invested in a technology that isn't going to perform as well as the next technology. So it raises further questions about the maintenance cycles, because if the thing is continually evolving, at what point do you buy in? At what point do you put your cards down the table and say, that's it, okay, we'll go at this point? And that, I think, is a difficult thing as well, and it adds to the complexity when predicting maintenance and future payback, etc., I suppose, for the product. Yeah. But I suppose that also weighs up against the way renewable heat incentive works, such that digression is there to mean that whenever you get to the next generation of technology, the payments have gone down, but that reflects the fact that hopefully the technology becomes cheaper and hopefully the technology becomes easier to maintain. So it's a balancing act. I think it's a question of getting the argument across and providing enough data for somebody to make a decision. But I think it's always going to be difficult to actually make that decision unless there's somebody leading the way and guiding it.
Mm-hmm. Here's a comment from Zoe Holiday of Energy Saving Trust. The Energy Saving Trust has undertaken 40 interviews with Scottish social housing providers to find out about the uptake of feed-in tariff projects. The results will be available within the next 2 weeks and very much complement what has been said by the speakers today. Well, that's interesting. Yes. We have a question here. Just a second, yes, please.
It's Charlie Russell again. I'm fascinated by this talk. just in terms of the communities that were represented, I know that it's from the same city, and that's great. But you and I know that housing associations in one part of the city can be completely different. And how much does, so my question is, how much does the community itself reflect the type of housing organization that the people in the community?
Yeah, I see a strong relationship in the data between how the communities perceive themselves to be perceived as opposed to other housing associations. So one of the housing associations, for example, sees itself as very innovative in a lot of social issues and providing lots of things that other housing associations in the same city are not doing. And so they have a sort of character, and that is also, I think, reflected in their tenant body. That the tenants approach those housing associations as opposed to their competitors because they see them as acting in specific ways. Now, some people are choosing housing out of needs, but some people are choosing housing associations on the basis of these kinds of characteristics, and so that's self-fulfilling, so that the tenants who are attracted to a more innovative, outgoing housing association reinforce the outgoingness and the innovativeness of that housing association. But in lots of cases, I think what we see is, particularly in Housing Association 1, even though it sees itself, Housing Association 2, it sees itself as very innovative, it does not consult in the decision-making about low-carbon technologies with its tenants or with its housing manager. The housing people who actually control the housing stock and have the day-to-day dealings with the clients are not consulted in this decision at all. It's taken entirely by the maintenance and development crew and that side of the business. And they imagine what their tenants will want. And it's this difference between the protection and the sponsoring that David was speaking about. So I think there is an element of that, and certainly organisational culture is not something that we can stop at the edges of an organisation, or much less at the edges of the management of that organisation. But yes, I think that they do differ here, but they don't necessarily explain the decisions, because despite their beliefs about tenants and supporting tenants, they saw the decision about that particular low carbon technology investment as none of their business really, and they would do it in their best interests. And that was done very much within the management of the organisation, and actually within the development management of the organisation. Maintenance were informed, but they weren't part of that decision-making process. But as in the other organisation, the maintenance and the development and the housing managers all sat down and tried to make this decision together, and the outcome is a reject. So
I think within that, so there's an issue of the leadership aspect of it with regard to the level of trust, if you want, within that decision making. And that in the housing association too, there seemed to be evidence that they trusted the decision that this was the right way to go. So in a way, they didn't really need to be consulted and a formal part of the decision making process. They trusted the decision, they followed the decision. There wasn't the need to consult in that way.
Because again, very similar views in the two organisations. In the first organisation, they say, well, we don't know very much about this technology, and maintenance is going to be a real headache, and this will make it difficult, and that affects their decision to reject. In the second organisation, they go, well, we don't know very much about this technology, and maintenance is probably going to be a real headache. But you know, this person who's the development manager, he's really keen on this, and well, it's probably the right thing to do. You know, why not? And the finance manager says, well, there's no financial implication for us. Why wouldn't you? If the choice is between putting in a technology that's green and a technology that's not, and there's no financial implication, are we having this conversation? There's no, there's nothing to decide.
No need for it.
So it's The same, again, lots of similarities in the views of the riskiness and the views of the maintenance problems, but different decisions are ultimately taken. And these are to do with deeply embedded issues in the character of these organisations, rather than anything to do with the technologies or the policies or the politics or the governance of these structures.
Yeah. Any more questions here in the audience? Here is one from our online viewer. Just a second, let me open it. It seems that I have lost it. I would kindly ask you to write again, whoever that was, because, oh, no. Well, it's not there on my screen. I'm sorry, but there is a little glitch in software, but I don't see it here. Maybe we can wait for that question. What I noticed in your report when I read it, there was a comment from the Housing Association 1 that fuel poverty is of greater concern than reducing carbon. Well, it seems that they do not appreciate that, for example, just by increasing insulation, you can achieve both goals, reduce fuel poverty and reduce carbon emissions. So it seems that, for example, this link between the two is not well emphasized to housing associations or other users, that you can achieve both goals by doing.
It's often true as well. I've done a lot of work with individual decision making, and what you find is that you're looking at lots of different decision outcomes. For example, the purchase of fair trade coffee or organic vegetables. But you often find that the reasons that people buy organic vegetables are perhaps nothing to do with sustainability and everything to do with health. So that the reason that people walk to work might be to do with fitness rather than to do with the environment. And so it's very interesting. You can't tell what people's intentions are by looking at their actions, and I think it's the same in this case. So the fact that somebody might take on a low carbon technology doesn't necessarily mean they're doing it for a green reason. If they're doing it for a fuel poverty reason, as an environmentalist, I would have to say, I don't care, as long as they do it. So I think it's perhaps the other way around, that what you need to do is promote both kinds of benefits in the hope that each kind of benefit will appeal to different kinds of user.
I think as well, it's interesting in the context of the Scottish Housing Quality Standard. That has meant that housing associations have had to do minimum level of work to their properties. But that's coming to an end in 2015, so many are now asking, well, what's next? And that in itself acts as a barrier to change, because when you don't know what's over the horizon, you don't know what's coming next, you don't want to act in case you do something that you don't have to, you spend money in a way you don't need to. So I think as well there needs to be a bit of guidance as to what's the next stage in the process, even at a governmental level.
Okay, thank you very much. Along the previous lines, here is a comment from Harry Phillips. It is clearly more effort to take on new technology than to reject it. Good leadership will look for every opportunity to improve conditions for tenants, especially with regard to resolving fuel poverty issues. This topic alone justifies taking risk. Well, if there are no more questions, I think we are now close to 2 o'clock, if not already over 2 o'clock, and this is time to close our seminar and webinar. First of all, I would like to thank our speakers for their talks, and to the audience here and online for attending the event. I think that was very good indication for us when you mentioned, Seonaidh, that more research, more independent information is required to persuade the housing associations and other clients of the benefits of new technologies. And that is what our project offers. CIC Start Online offers funding for feasibility studies and for academic consultancy to provide independent verification of cost effectiveness of different technologies. We still have funding for 34 feasibility studies and for 11 academic consultancies. And the next submission deadline is 13th of May. You are very welcome to contact me to ask for more information, but you will find more information also on our website in the section Feasibility Study and Academic Consultancy. We really look forward to receiving applications for either feasibility studies or academic consultancy and welcoming you at our next seminar and webinar. And the title of that next seminar is Development of Post-Occupancy Evaluation for Evaluation of Innovative Low-Carbon Social Housing Projects. Very well linked to today's topic. And this feasibility study was undertaken by Macintosh Environmental Architecture Research Unit at Glasgow School of Art and John Gilbert Architects. So our next seminar and webinar will be on Thursday, 14th of April, 2011. I would also like to say that there are sponsorship opportunities for each seminar and webinar. If you would like to be a sponsor of any of our webinars with your sponsor logo on our video, you are very welcome to contact us and we will provide more information. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you for giving an interesting talk, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.